Two young identical twin girls vanished without a trace from a quiet neighborhood in Madison, Wisconsin on Halloween in 1969, disappearing while trick-or-treating on their own street. They never came home. No clues, no witnesses, no suspects. Then the case went cold. But 15 years later, their mother spots a crucial detail hidden in the background of an old photograph. A detail that had been hiding in plain sight all those years. A shocking discovery that would expose a secret that had been carefully concealed for over a decade and lead to an impossible reunion. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive mystery stories. The October wind carried the scent of dried leaves and approaching winter. Outside the Morrison home on Chamberlain Avenue in Madison, Wisconsin, the sky had begun its early autumn darkening, that peculiar transition from afternoon to evening that only happens in late fall. The houses on the quiet, tree-lined street were lit from within, porch lights glowing amber in the gathering dusk. Jack-o'-lanterns sat on stoops, their carved faces flickering with candlelight. From various homes came the sound of children's laughter, excited voices calling to one another. Elizabeth Morrison stood in the doorway of her home, a bowl of candy balanced on one hip. She was 55 years old now, her hair silvered by 15 years of grief. She wore a cardigan sweater in soft cream, and her eyes, when they weren't lost in memory, were the color of winter sky. Beside her stood her husband Michael, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. They had learned, over the past decade and a half, how to touch each other in ways that said more than words ever could. It was October 31st, 1984, Halloween. The first group of children came to the door around 5 o'clock, a cluster of second and third graders accompanied by a parent who hung back on the sidewalk supervising. Elizabeth smiled at them with the careful precision she had learned, the smile that said she was present, engaged, but not threatening. The children held out their bags and pillowcases, and she distributed candy with gentle hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison," they chorused, and then they were off, running to the next house, their costumes, a superhero, a witch, a pumpkin, luminous in the gathering dark. More groups followed. Elizabeth found a rhythm. Smile, hand out candy, watch them go. Michael remained in the doorway behind her, his presence solid and supportive. They had done this before over many Halloweens, but this particular Halloween was always difficult. 15 years difficult. Since the evening their own daughters had left this house in matching golden costumes and never returned. Around 6 o'clock, as the sky deepened to the color of bruised plums, another group approached. 5 children, ages 7 to 9, accompanied by a woman Elizabeth recognized as a neighbor from further down the street. The children held out their bags. 4 of them were standard costumes, a cowboy, a ghost, a ballerina. But the 5th child wore something different, an autumn fairy costume. The dress was golden, with panels of deep bronze and rust that caught the light like leaves. Around the child's small waist was a belt made of artificial leaves, carefully stitched. The child wore a flower crown made of silk roses and autumn branches, and fairy wings, gossamer and iridescent, were attached at her shoulders. The child's face was painted with glitter in shades of gold and copper. Elizabeth's hand froze in the act of reaching toward the candy bowl. The dress was not identical to the one her daughters had worn 15 years ago, but it was close enough. Close enough in color, close enough in concept, close enough to stop time. Somewhere in Elizabeth's chest, 15 years of suppressed grief cracked open like an egg. She did not make a conscious decision to move. Her body simply moved. She stepped forward, the candy bowl forgotten, and wrapped her arms around the small child, pulling her close. She buried her face in the child's hair and held on as though holding on tight enough might reverse time itself. The child went rigid with shock. "Oh," Elizabeth whispered. "Oh, sweetheart! Oh, my—" The child began to cry. Not the experimental crying of a child seeking comfort, but the genuine, terrified crying of a child who had been grabbed by a stranger. The sound was sharp and panicked. "No, let go! Mom! Mom!" Michael stepped forward immediately, his hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "Elizabeth! Elizabeth! Honey, you have to let go." Elizabeth's arms released the child as if burnt by fire. The child stumbled backward, her eyes wide with fear, her flower crown askew. She ran to the woman who had accompanied the group, her mother, who immediately knelt and gathered the child into protective arms. "What was that about?" the woman demanded, her voice sharp with maternal fury. "Why did you grab my daughter?" Elizabeth couldn't form words. Michael wrapped his arm around her waist, supporting her. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to frighten her. It was just the costume. It reminded me of—" She couldn't finish. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down from the Morrisons, stepped forward. She was in her 60s, kind-faced, and she looked at Elizabeth with immediate understanding. "Elizabeth's daughters disappeared 15 years ago," she said quietly to the other mother. "On Halloween. They were 6 years old. They wore costumes very similar to this one." Understanding flooded across the other mother's face. "I didn't know. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize—" Michael stepped forward. "It's not your fault. My wife is still processing the loss. The costume was just unexpected." Over the next several minutes, Michael managed the situation with the kindness and careful precision that had sustained their marriage through 15 years of loss. He brought out additional treats, smiled at the children, apologized to the other mother, explained about their daughters in a voice that was steady, even though it cost him something to maintain that steadiness. The group eventually left, the mother reassuring her daughter, casting sympathetic glances back at Elizabeth. When they were gone, Michael guided Elizabeth inside. She moved like someone walking through water, her movements slow and disconnected. Michael closed the door and led her to the sofa in the living room. He sat beside her and pulled her into his arms, and she let herself fold into him, trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare that child." "I know," Michael said. "I know you didn't." "The dress, Michael. It was so close. It was so close to the one we bought for them." "I know." They sat there as the evening deepened outside, as more children came to the door, and Michael rose to distribute candy, as the sounds of Halloween continued on around them. And Elizabeth remained on the sofa, held by her husband's absence of words, held by something deeper than language. Later that night, after the trick-or-treaters had moved on to other neighborhoods and the street had grown quiet, Elizabeth rose from the sofa. Michael looked at her with quiet concern. "I want to look at the photographs," she said, "from that afternoon before they left." Michael didn't argue. He understood. They kept the photographs in a cedar chest in the bedroom upstairs, carefully preserved in albums and boxes, a time capsule of a life that had been stolen from them. Michael carried down the heavy box and set it on the coffee table. Elizabeth opened it slowly, her hands gentle with the fragile contents. On top lay the leather-bound photo album from 1969, the cover worn smooth from years of handling. Elizabeth opened the album. The pages turned with a soft, whispering sound. Photographs appeared, memories made manifest, the twins as infants, the twins learning to walk, the twins at their first birthday, years of moments compressed into images. Michael sat beside his wife. He took her hand. Neither of them spoke. Then Elizabeth reached a particular page. Her breath caught. The photographs on this page were dated October 31st, 1969, and taken in the front yard of their home before the girls would leave for trick-or-treating that afternoon. Sophie and Rachel stood on the front lawn, arm in arm, the Morrison house visible behind them. They wore matching golden dresses with panels of deep bronze and rust that resembled autumn leaves. Around each girl's head was a crown made of silk flowers and autumn branches. Fairy wings, carefully constructed by Elizabeth's hands, were attached at their shoulders. Their young faces were painted with glitter in shades of gold and copper. They were smiling with the unself-conscious joy that only 6-year-olds possess, their gap-toothed grins identical, their eyes bright and alive. They looked like autumn made manifest, like magic. Elizabeth and Michael had taken these photographs at 2:47 p.m. on October 31st, 1969. The girls had left the house at 3:15 p.m. Not with the neighborhood group. They had wanted to go together first, just the two of them, to a few houses on their street. They would catch up with the other children later, they had promised. It was safe. It was their neighborhood. Nothing bad ever happened on Chamberlain Avenue. But they never made it to the neighborhood group. They never came home. Elizabeth looked at her daughters in that photograph, frozen in time, and then, for the first time in all these years of looking, her attention shifted beyond their faces. She found herself looking at the background of the photograph, at the street behind the girls, at the neighboring yards visible at the edges of the frame. And there, partially visible on the sidewalk near the corner, just barely in frame, was a dog, a small Pomeranian with distinctive rust-colored fur. The dog wore a bright blue collar with a small bell attached that caught the afternoon light. Elizabeth's eyes went very still. "Michael," she said quietly. "Michael, look at this." Michael leaned closer. "What am I looking at?" "The background, the Pomeranian. Do you see it?" Michael studied the photograph. "Yes, I see it. That looks like Margaret Holbrook's dog. The girls always talked about that dog. They wanted one just like it." Elizabeth's finger traced the dog's image in the photograph. Margaret Holbrook. She lived at the end of the street, in that house at the corner where the dead end turns around. Do you remember her, Michael? Very quiet. Kept to herself. "Yes," Michael said slowly. "I remember. She was isolated, I think. Didn't socialize much. Her house was set back from the others, kind of hidden by those big trees." "Didn't she move away?" Elizabeth asked, still staring at the photograph. "I remember now. Around that time, right around Halloween. She had said something about moving. Do you remember?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. His brow furrowed as he searched his memory. Yes, I think so. She told Mrs. Patterson she was moving, sometime in late October. I remember because when the police were investigating, they talked to all the neighbors except her. She had already left. Elizabeth felt her heart begin to beat faster. "Then why?" she asked slowly. "Is her dog in this photograph? This was taken at 2:47 in the afternoon on Halloween. If she had already moved days before, why is her dog here? On our street? On Halloween afternoon?" The question hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Michael reached out and took the photograph from Elizabeth's hands. He studied it carefully, holding it toward the lamplight, examining every detail. His jaw tightened. "That is her dog," he confirmed. "There's no mistaking that collar. The blue collar with the bell. The girls mentioned that bell. They said they could hear it jingling." "But she was supposed to be gone," Elizabeth whispered. "The neighbors saw her move, days before Halloween." Michael set down the photograph and looked at his wife. "Elizabeth," he said gently, "what are you thinking?" She turned to face him fully. "I'm thinking something doesn't make sense. I'm thinking maybe we need to know more about Margaret Holbrook, about where she went, about why her dog was here on Halloween when she wasn't supposed to be." Michael was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "You think she had something to do with it?" It was not a question. Elizabeth's hands were trembling. She clasped them together in her lap. "I don't know what I think, but I need to find out." Michael stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. "Elizabeth, do you remember what the police said? They searched this entire neighborhood. They brought in dogs. They interviewed everyone. They found nothing, no trace, no evidence, no witnesses." "I remember," Elizabeth said quietly. "They talked to everyone on this street except Margaret because she had already moved. The neighbors confirmed it. They saw her packing, saw the moving truck, saw her leave. Days before Halloween." Michael turned back to face his wife. The tracking dogs found no trail leading to her house, no scent, nothing. "I know," Elizabeth said. "I know all of that, Michael. But look at this photograph. Look at this dog. It's here. On Halloween, hours before our daughters disappeared." "Maybe she came back," Michael suggested, though his voice lacked conviction, "to pick up something she forgot." "On Halloween?" Elizabeth asked. "She came back on Halloween, and nobody saw her, and the girls never mentioned seeing her?" Michael had no answer for that. Elizabeth stood and crossed to her husband. She took his hands in hers. "Do you remember what else the police said? After the first few weeks, after the search came up empty?" Michael's voice was rough. "They said the girls were probably taken by someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone who could approach them without frightening them." "Someone they knew," Elizabeth repeated. "Michael, the girls loved that dog. They talked about it all the time. If they saw Margaret, if they saw that dog, they would have gone to her. They would have trusted her." Michael pulled his wife close. "But Elizabeth, how could one woman kidnap two children? How could she take them both without anyone seeing, without anyone hearing?" "I don't know how," Elizabeth said, "but I know something isn't right here. I can feel it." She pulled back to look at her husband's face. "Michael, please, I need to understand this. I need to know if there's any chance at all, that Margaret Holbrook knows something about what happened to our daughters." Michael searched his wife's eyes. He saw the desperate hope there, the same hope he had watched dim and flicker over 15 years of dead ends and false leads and prayers that seemed to go unanswered. He had watched Elizabeth pray every night. "Please, Jesus, bring them home. Please let them be alive. Please give me a sign." Was this the sign? But he also saw something else in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in a very long time: determination, purpose. The particular fire of a mother who believes she might finally have a thread to pull. "All right," Michael said quietly. "All right, we'll look into this. We'll find out what happened to Margaret Holbrook. We'll find out where she went. And if there's any connection at all, we'll follow it." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Michael." They stood together in their living room, holding each other, the photograph of their daughters lying on the coffee table, a small dog with a blue collar frozen in time at the edge of the frame. But for Elizabeth and Michael Morrison, something new was beginning. The next morning, Elizabeth called Mrs. Patterson. When Mrs. Patterson answered the phone, Elizabeth found herself asking, without preamble, "Do you remember Margaret Holbrook?" There was a pause. Then, "Of course I remember Margaret. She lived at the end of the street in that isolated house. Very quiet woman." "Why do you ask, Elizabeth?" "I need to know about her," Elizabeth said. "About when she moved, about where she went, anything you can remember." Another pause, longer this time. "Elizabeth, is everything all right? This is about your daughters, isn't it?" "Please," Elizabeth said. "I just need to understand something. Can I come over?" Mrs. Patterson invited Elizabeth over for coffee. When Elizabeth arrived 20 minutes later, she found her neighbor in the kitchen preparing 2 cups with ritual care. "Margaret was a sad woman," Mrs. Patterson said, once they were seated. "Very quiet. She kept to herself almost entirely. I only knew her because we occasionally saw her in the yard with that little dog of hers. She seemed to love that dog more than anything." "Do you know what happened to her?" Elizabeth asked. "Why she was so isolated?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew somber. "Yes, actually. Margaret had experienced a terrible tragedy. Her husband and her twin children were killed in a car accident. This was in early 1969, I believe. Margaret was the only survivor. She was driving at the time." Elizabeth felt the ground shift slightly beneath her feet. "She lost twin children?" "Yes, a boy and a girl, I think, and her husband, all in the same accident. The woman was never the same after that. She withdrew entirely from the world. She got a job as a freelance writer, something she could do from home, and she lived a very solitary existence. The only companionship she seemed to have was that little Pomeranian. Elizabeth's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Do you know when she moved and where she went? It was right before Halloween in 1969, Mrs. Patterson said. I remember because I thought it was odd timing, moving right before a holiday. She said she had received a job opportunity, something about freelance work that required her to relocate. She seemed anxious about the move, if I remember correctly, not excited, but anxious. Do you remember where she moved to? Elizabeth asked carefully. She mentioned North Carolina, Mrs. Patterson said. Somewhere on the coast, I think. She said something about needing a fresh start, about getting away from the memories here. Did you ever see her again? Elizabeth asked. After she left? No, never. Mrs. Patterson studied Elizabeth's face. Elizabeth, what is this about? Why are you asking about Margaret Holbrook after all these years? Elizabeth pulled the photograph from her purse, the one from Halloween 1969. She showed Mrs. Patterson the image of her daughters in their golden costumes. Then she pointed to the small dog visible at the edge of the frame. This was taken on Halloween afternoon, Elizabeth said, at 2:47 p.m. Margaret's dog is in this photograph. If she had already moved days earlier, why was her dog still here? Mrs. Patterson's hand rose to cover her mouth. She stared at the photograph, her eyes widening. Oh, Elizabeth, she whispered, you don't think— I don't know what I think, Elizabeth said, but I need to find out. Mrs. Patterson, you said the neighbors saw her move before Halloween. Are you certain about that? Mrs. Patterson's brow furrowed as she thought back. Yes, I'm certain. I saw the moving truck myself. It was several days before Halloween, maybe 3 or 4 days before. She had told me she was leaving that week, and then she was gone. The house was empty when Halloween came. But what if she came back? Elizabeth asked. What if she returned for something? And nobody knew because the neighbors who lived closest to her, the Hendersons, they went on vacation that week, didn't they? Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened further. Yes, she said slowly. Yes, the Hendersons left for Florida the day before Halloween. They were gone for 2 weeks. She looked down at the photograph again. So, if Margaret did come back, the only people who might have seen her were my daughters, Elizabeth finished quietly. Mrs. Patterson set down her coffee cup. Her hand was shaking. Elizabeth, if what you're thinking is true, if Margaret had anything to do with your daughter's disappearance, why would she do such a thing? She lost her own twins, Elizabeth said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. She lost them in an accident. She was alone, isolated, grieving. And then she saw my daughters, identical twins, the same age her children would have been if they had lived, wearing fairy costumes on her street. Oh, my God, Mrs. Patterson whispered. Elizabeth folded the photograph carefully and returned it to her purse. If I wanted to find someone who moved to North Carolina in 1969, how would I do that? I don't know, Mrs. Patterson said. This was 15 years ago, Elizabeth. She could be anywhere. But I have to try, Elizabeth said. I have to know if there's any truth to this. Please, if you remember anything else about Margaret, anything at all about where she went or what she said, will you call me? Of course, Mrs. Patterson said. She reached across the table and squeezed Elizabeth's hand. I hope you find answers. I really do. That evening, Elizabeth and Michael sat in their bedroom, the photograph of the twins laid out between them on the bed. Elizabeth had spent the entire afternoon trying to piece together a plan. I have a friend from university, Elizabeth said. Rebecca. She lives in Wilmington, North Carolina. We've kept in touch over the years. Christmas cards, the occasional phone call. I could call her, tell her we're thinking of taking a vacation to the coast. Michael nodded slowly. And while we're there, we look for Margaret. It's a long shot, Elizabeth admitted. North Carolina is a big state. The coast alone stretches for hundreds of miles, and we don't even know if she settled there. But it's more than we've had in 15 years, Michael said. He reached for his wife's hand. Elizabeth, I want you to understand something. The chances of finding Margaret, let alone finding any connection to our daughters, are very small. I don't want you to get your hopes up only to have them crushed again. "I know," Elizabeth said. "But Michael, what if this is it? What if this is the answer we've been praying for all these years? What if God is finally showing us the way?" Michael looked at his wife's face, at the hope and determination there, at the fierce love of a mother who had never stopped searching. He thought about all the prayers he had heard her whisper in the darkness. "Then we go," Michael said firmly. "We take a vacation. We enjoy the beach. And while we're there, we look for Margaret Holbrook. Quietly, carefully. We see what we can find." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "You mean it?" "I mean it," Michael said. "We've waited 15 years. We can take a week to follow this lead." Over the next few days, they made their plans. Elizabeth called her friend Rebecca, who was delighted and insisted they rent a cottage at Wrightsville Beach. Michael arranged time off from work. Elizabeth packed with careful hands. On the morning they left, Elizabeth stood in her daughter's bedroom. She hadn't changed it in 15 years. The twin beds were still made. The stuffed animals still sat on the shelves. "I'm going to find you," Elizabeth whispered to the empty room. "Wherever you are, I'm going to find you. I promise." She closed the door gently and joined Michael in the car. They drove south through Illinois, through Kentucky, through Tennessee, the landscape gradually changing from autumn gold to something greener, warmer, more alive. Elizabeth dozed in the passenger seat, and Michael drove with his thoughts, wondering what they would find at the end of this long road. Was this journey a fool's errand? Or was it, as Elizabeth believed, an answer to 15 years of prayer? The cottage was small but comfortable, painted pale blue with white shutters. It sat on a quiet street about 3 blocks from Wrightsville Beach. Outside, palm trees swayed in the Atlantic wind. The air smelled of salt and sunscreen and the particular warmth of the Carolina coast in late autumn. Michael had driven most of the way, with Elizabeth sleeping in the passenger seat during the long stretches. When they arrived at the cottage in the late afternoon, Michael was exhausted. "I'm going to rest for a while," he said, collapsing onto the cottage's bed. "That drive wore me out. Why don't you take a walk on the beach, clear your head? You slept in the car. You're not as tired as I am." Elizabeth hesitated, but Michael was already closing his eyes. She quietly left the cottage and made her way down the quiet street toward the sound of the ocean. Wrightsville Beach was less crowded than she had expected for late October. Elizabeth walked barefoot on the sand, her shoes in her hand, the afternoon sun warm on her face. She did not have a plan. She was simply walking, breathing, trying to quiet the anxiety that had lived in her chest for 15 years. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when something caught her eye. A small baking stand sat near a public pavilion on the street that ran parallel to the beach. A folding table displayed an array of baked goods, pies, brownies, cookies arranged on colorful plates. A hand-painted sign proclaimed, "Fresh baked goods. Ask for today's special." A young woman stood behind the table, serving a customer, wrapping brownies in foil with practiced efficiency. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a casual sundress and moved with easy, comfortable gestures. Something about her was familiar. Elizabeth slowed her steps, studying the young woman from a distance, the way she tilted her head when she smiled at the customer, the particular grace of her hand movements as she wrapped the baked goods. The shape of her profile, something in it tugged at Elizabeth's memory, though she couldn't place what. The customer paid and walked away. The young woman began rearranging her display, humming softly to herself. Elizabeth found herself drawn forward, her feet carrying her toward the stand. As she got closer, she could see the young woman's face more clearly, delicate features, high cheekbones, an elegant jawline that gave her face a mature, refined quality. But the eyes, those dark, expressive eyes. And when the young woman glanced up and smiled briefly at someone passing by, Elizabeth's breath caught. That smile. The way the left corner lifted slightly higher than the right, the warmth that lit up the young woman's whole face. Elizabeth knew that smile. She had seen it before, in memories that felt like lifetimes ago. In photographs she had studied until every detail was burned into her soul. In dreams that woke her in the middle of the night, gasping with grief. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Her daughters would be 21 now, the same age as this young woman. They would have grown from round-faced children into elegant young adults. Their features would have changed, matured, refined. But that smile, that particular asymmetric smile, no. She was seeing things. She was seeing what she wanted to see because of 15 years of desperate hope. Wasn't she? Elizabeth's heart was already beating faster. Her feet were already moving forward, as if her body knew something her mind was still struggling to accept. She couldn't walk away. Not until she knew for certain. Not until she could prove to herself that this was just another trick of grief and longing. She stepped closer, drawn by something she didn't fully understand. And then she saw the dog. A small Pomeranian sat beside the table, partly hidden in the shade, rust-colored fur liberally streaked with gray, especially around its muzzle and eyes. The dog was clearly elderly, its movements slow and careful, its eyes slightly clouded with age. But it was well cared for, its coat brushed and clean. Around its neck was a blue collar, faded from years of sun and wear, but unmistakably blue, with a small brass bell attached. The bell made a soft jingling sound when the dog shifted position. Elizabeth froze. That bell, that sound, she knew that sound. The world seemed to narrow to just that small brass bell, that particular tinkling note that her daughters had loved 15 years ago. "Mama, can we get a dog with a bell like that? Please?" Elizabeth's hands trembled. She forced herself to keep walking forward to approach the table. The young woman looked up and smiled. "Hi there. Can I interest you in something? The apple pie is really popular today." Elizabeth's mouth was dry. She forced herself to speak. "Your dog is beautiful. Is it a Pomeranian?" "Yes." The young woman's face lit up. "This is Duchess. She's our family dog. Getting up there in years, but she's still happy and healthy." She reached down to pet the dog affectionately, and the dog's tail wagged gently. Elizabeth knelt down slowly. The elderly dog looked up at her with clouded but friendly eyes. Elizabeth reached out with a shaking hand and touched the dog's head. The fur was soft, graying. The dog leaned into her touch. Her eyes moved to the collar, the faded blue collar with its brass bell. "She's very friendly," the young woman said. "Do you like dogs?" "I do," Elizabeth managed. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. For the first time she really looked at the young woman's face, and the world tilted. The young woman had delicate features, dark eyes, a particular way of holding her head, a slight tilt to the left when she spoke. Her smile was warm and genuine, lighting up her whole face. Elizabeth knew that smile. She had seen it in photographs. She had seen it in memories that played behind her eyes every single day for 15 years. "Are you all right?" the young woman asked, concern crossing her face. "You look pale. Would you like to sit down?" "No," Elizabeth said quickly. "No, I'm fine. She gestured to the baked goods. "I'd like to buy something. The apple pie, you said?" "Yes, it's really good. Baked fresh this morning." The young woman began wrapping a slice with practiced efficiency. Elizabeth watched the young woman's hands as she worked. Slender fingers, careful movements, and there, just visible when her sleeve pulled back, on her left wrist, a birthmark, small, shaped like a tiny leaf. Elizabeth's vision blurred. She gripped the edge of the table. "Are you sure you're okay?" the young woman asked again, setting down the wrapped pie. "You really don't look well." "I'm fine," Elizabeth whispered. But she wasn't fine. She was looking at her daughter. She was certain of it. This young woman, this stranger who didn't know her, was Sophie. Her Sophie, grown up, alive. The birthmark didn't lie. Sophie had been born with that exact mark. Elizabeth had kissed it 1,000 times. "That's $4, the young woman said, handing over the pie. Elizabeth fumbled for her wallet, pulled out a $5 bill with trembling hands. "Keep the change." "Thank you." The young woman's smile was bright and genuine. "Are you visiting the area? I haven't seen you around before." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "Just arrived today, staying at a cottage nearby. This looks delicious. Do you bake these yourself?" "My aunt does," the young woman said warmly. "She's amazing. We travel around, selling at different beaches and markets. It's a nice life." She gestured to the white camper van. "We live in there. It's cozy." "We?" Elizabeth asked carefully. "You and—" "My sister," the young woman said. There was warmth in her voice when she said sister. "We're very close. She's resting right now. We take turns at the stand." Sister. Elizabeth's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Before she could ask anything more, the door of the camper van opened. A woman stepped out. She was older than Elizabeth, perhaps in her early 60s, with dark hair streaked with gray, pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple floral dress and an apron. She moved with careful precision. Elizabeth knew that face, Margaret Holbrook, older, more lined, more weathered by whatever 15 years had brought her. But undeniably Margaret. For a frozen moment, their eyes met. Recognition flickered across Margaret's face, a flash of shock followed immediately by something more guarded. Her body went rigid. Her hand gripped the door frame of the camper van. Margaret recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. Elizabeth had seen it. The moment of panic, the recognition, the fear. Margaret stepped down from the camper van and walked to the table. She placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder, a protective, possessive gesture. "Grace," she said. Her voice was calm, but Elizabeth heard the strain underneath it. "Why don't you take a break, dear? Go inside and rest." "But I'm not tired." The young woman, Grace, protested. "Please," Margaret said. There was steel in her voice now. "I need you to go inside." Grace looked confused but obedient. She cast one more glance at Elizabeth, then climbed into the camper van, the door closing behind her. Margaret and Elizabeth stood facing each other across the table of baked goods. The ocean breeze stirred Margaret's hair. The dog sat between them, oblivious to the tension. "Margaret Holbrook," Elizabeth said. Her voice was steady. "I thought I recognized you." Margaret's jaw tightened, but when she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "Elizabeth Morrison, what a surprise. What brings you to North Carolina?" "Vacation," Elizabeth said. "My husband and I needed a change of scenery. We're visiting the area." "How nice," Margaret said. She began straightening items on the table, a nervous gesture. "It's been a long time." 15 years, Elizabeth said. A flicker of something crossed Margaret's face, but her voice remained calm. "Yes, I moved away for work. A fresh start after everything." "After your family," Elizabeth said quietly. "The accident. I was so sorry to hear about that, Margaret." "Thank you," Margaret said stiffly. "It was difficult, but that was a long time ago." Elizabeth paused, watching Margaret's face carefully. "Margaret, my daughters, they disappeared 15 years ago, on Halloween, 1969. They were 6 years old." Margaret's hand stilled on the tablecloth. Her eyes widened slightly. "What? I didn't know." "Elizabeth, that's terrible. What happened?" "They went trick-or-treating," Elizabeth said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Just the two of them, on our own street. They never came home. We searched everywhere. The police investigated for months. But there was never any trace. No witnesses, nothing." That's every parent's worst nightmare," Margaret said. Her face showed what looked like genuine shock and sympathy. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. When did you say this happened?" "October 31st, 1969, Halloween night." "I had already moved by then," Margaret said. I left in late October, several days before Halloween. The moving truck came on October 27th. Several neighbors saw me leave. Yes, I remember, Elizabeth said. You moved for a job opportunity, I think? Yes, Margaret said quickly. A writing opportunity. I needed to get away from the memories in Madison. Of course, Elizabeth said. She paused, then reached into her purse. Margaret, can I show you something? She pulled out the photograph, the one from Halloween Day. She laid it on the table between them. This was taken on Halloween, Elizabeth said. At 2:47 in the afternoon, these are my daughters, Sophie and Rachel. Do you see them? Margaret looked down at the photograph. Elizabeth watched her face carefully. They're beautiful, Margaret said softly. They look so happy. They were, Elizabeth said. And do you see what's in the background? Right here, at the edge? Margaret's eyes moved to where Elizabeth was pointing. Her face went very still. That's a dog, Elizabeth said. A Pomeranian, with a blue collar and a bell. It looks just like Duchess, your dog. For several long seconds, Margaret said nothing. That's not Duchess, Margaret said finally. It must be another Pomeranian. They're fairly common, and blue collars. My daughters talked about your dog, Elizabeth said. They loved that bell. They wanted a dog just like Duchess. I'm sure many dogs have bells, Margaret said. Her voice was firmer now, more controlled. Elizabeth, I understand you're grieving. I understand you're looking for answers, but you're seeing connections that aren't there. Am I? Elizabeth asked quietly. She paused, then said, The young woman at your stand, Grace, she has a birthmark on her left wrist. Margaret's face went perfectly still. My daughter Sophie has a birthmark exactly like that, Elizabeth continued, in exactly the same place, shaped like a leaf. That's ridiculous, Margaret said, but her voice was shaking now. Grace is my niece, my sister's daughter. My sister died, and I took in her girls. They're twins, Grace and Claire. They've been with me for years. Where's your sister buried? Elizabeth asked. What was her name? That's none of your business, Margaret snapped. My family history is my own. Does Grace have a twin? Elizabeth asked. You said girls, plural. Can I meet them both? No, Margaret said firmly. You're upsetting my nieces with your wild accusations. I think you should leave. Margaret? I said leave. Margaret's voice rose sharply. I'm sorry for what happened to your daughters, Elizabeth. I truly am. But my nieces are not your children. They don't know you, and I won't have you disturbing them. Margaret turned away and called into the camper van. Grace, start packing up. We're closing early. But we just opened... Grace's voice came from inside. Now, Grace. Margaret's voice was sharp, almost panicked. The door opened. Grace emerged, looking confused and concerned. She began gathering the baked goods. And then the door opened again. Another young woman appeared, identical to Grace. Same dark hair, same delicate features, same age. Twins. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She was looking at both of her daughters, Sophie and Rachel, alive, right in front of her. The second young woman, Claire, looked at the scene with confusion. What's going on? Why are we... Claire, get back inside. Margaret's voice was desperate now. Now! But what's happening? Claire asked, frightened. Inside. Both of you. Margaret was losing control, all pretense of calm gone. But Elizabeth had already stepped forward. Wait, she said. Please, I had twin daughters. They disappeared 15 years ago, on Halloween. They were 6 years old. Grace and Claire looked at her. Something flickered in Grace's eyes. That's terrible, Grace said softly. I'm so sorry. They wore golden fairy costumes, Elizabeth continued, her voice breaking. With autumn leaves and flower crowns, they had glitter on their faces. Get in the van. Margaret grabbed Grace's arm roughly. Both of you, now. Aunt Margaret, you're hurting me. Grace tried to pull away. Get in the van. Margaret's voice cracked. The twins looked frightened. They climbed into the camper van, casting worried glances back at Elizabeth. Margaret threw the folding table into the back of the van with shaking hands. She didn't look at Elizabeth. "Stay away from us. Stay away from my family." She climbed into the driver's seat. The engine started. The camper van pulled away from the curb with a lurch, leaving Elizabeth standing alone on the street. Elizabeth stood frozen, watching the camper van disappear. She had found them. After 15 years of searching, of praying, of hoping against hope, she had found her daughters. They were alive, and they had no idea who she was. Elizabeth returned to the cottage in a state of barely controlled chaos. Her face was streaked with tears. Her hands were shaking. She could barely open the cottage door. Michael was awake now, sitting on the small porch, reading. He looked up as his wife approached, and the book fell from his hands. "Elizabeth, what happened?" Elizabeth collapsed into the chair beside him. "I found them," she whispered. "Michael, I found them. I found Margaret. I found our daughters." Michael's face went white. "What?" "Elizabeth, slow down. Tell me what happened." Elizabeth told him everything. The words tumbled out in a rush. The camper van, the baked goods stand, the young woman with Sophie's birthmark, the second twin, Margaret's panic, the confrontation, the hasty departure. When she finished, Michael sat in stunned silence. "You're certain?" he finally asked. "You're absolutely certain it was them?" "The birthmark, Michael. Sophie's birthmark, exactly the same. And they're identical twins, the right age, living with Margaret Holbrook, who supposedly had no family." Elizabeth's voice was rising with urgency. "And Margaret recognized me. She panicked when she saw me. She made them leave immediately. She knows, Michael. She knows I know." Michael stood and paced the small porch. "But they don't know you. They called her aunt. They think she's their family." "She must have lied to them," Elizabeth said. "Don't you see? She took them on Halloween. She moved here. She's been raising them as her own, telling them their parents were dead, that she's their aunt. For 15 years, she's kept them from us." Michael knelt in front of his wife, taking her hands in his. "Elizabeth, we don't have absolute proof. We have a birthmark and a resemblance and a suspicious reaction. But Margaret will say they're her nieces. She'll have documents." "We have the photograph," Elizabeth said. "The one with the dog. It proves she was in Madison on Halloween. It proves she lied." "It proves her dog was in Madison," Michael corrected gently. "We need more." "Then we get more," Elizabeth said fiercely. "Michael, I'm not losing them again. I'm not letting her disappear with our daughters. Not again. Not after 15 years. Michael looked at his wife's face, at the determination there, at the fierce maternal love that had never dimmed. "Where would Margaret go?" he asked. "If she's running, where would she run to?" "She's been living here," Elizabeth said. "Somewhere nearby. She has a business. She has a routine. She can't just disappear instantly. She has a whole camper van full of equipment." "She might go to wherever she's been staying," Michael suggested. "A campground, an RV park." Elizabeth stood abruptly. "We need to find it. We need to find where she's staying before she leaves." "And then what?" Michael asked. "And then we call the police," Elizabeth said. "We give them everything we have, the photograph, the birthmark, the fact that Margaret lied about when she left Madison. We make them investigate." Michael studied his wife for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's go find them." They got in their rental car and began driving through Wrightsville Beach, looking for RV parks, for campgrounds, for anywhere a white camper van might be parked. As they drove, Elizabeth prayed silently. "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you for leading me to them. Please, please don't let me lose them again. Please help us bring them home." Somewhere in this small beach town, her daughters were alive, and Elizabeth was not going to rest until she brought them home. They found parkside camping just as the last light was fading from the sky. It was a sprawling property on Route 17, about 15 minutes from the beach, with dozens of campsites and RVs in various states of maintenance. Michael pulled into the entrance and stopped at a small office building. "Wait here," he said to Elizabeth. "Let me see if I can get information." He disappeared inside. Through the window, Elizabeth could see him talking to a man at the desk. Casual conversation, asking questions, nodding. She gripped the armrest, her knuckles white, her other hand clutching her purse in her lap. "Please," she prayed. "Please let them still be here." Michael emerged 5 minutes later and slid back into the driver's seat. His face was grave. "She's here," he said quietly. The man at the desk confirmed it. "A woman named Margaret Holbrook has been renting a long-term spot here for about 9 years. She lives in a white camper van. He says she's very quiet, keeps to herself. She has 2 young women living with her, twins, homeschooled, very well behaved." Elizabeth's hands began to shake. "Where? Where is she parked?" "Back corner of the property," Michael said. "Section C, spot 47. He paused. "Elizabeth, the man said Margaret came through about 30 minutes ago. She looked agitated. She loaded up supplies from the camp store, extra gas cans, food, water, like she's preparing for a long trip." "She's going to run," Elizabeth whispered. "She's going to take them and disappear again." "We need to call the police right now," Michael said, "before she leaves." Michael went back to the office and asked to use their phone. Elizabeth waited in the car, watching the entrance to the campground, terrified that any moment she'd see a white camper van drive past. Her heart pounded in her chest. Every vehicle that passed made her flinch. When Michael returned, his face was set with determination. "I spoke to a detective, Raymond Walsh. I told him everything, about our daughters, about Margaret, about the photograph, about finding them here. He's sending officers immediately. He told us to stay in the parking lot by the office and wait. Under no circumstances should we approach Margaret ourselves." "But what if she leaves before they get here?" Elizabeth asked desperately. "We stay here," Michael said firmly. "Elizabeth, if we approach her now, we could make things worse. We wait for the police." They sat in the car in the office parking lot, waiting. Elizabeth watched the road that led deeper into the campground, her eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. Michael held her hand, his thumb rubbing small circles on her palm, a gesture of comfort they'd developed over 15 years of shared grief. "We found them," Michael said quietly. "After 15 years, we found them. That's a miracle, Elizabeth. That's God answering your prayers." "But what if we lose them again?" Elizabeth whispered. "We won't," Michael said. "I won't let that happen." 15 minutes passed, 20. Elizabeth counted every second. Where were the police? Why was it taking so long? Then the office manager came running out, his face flushed, waving his arms. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison." He rushed to the driver's side window, out of breath. "That woman you were asking about. I just saw her camper van. She left through the back service road. She's heading out the rear exit, the one that leads to Route 17. Elizabeth's heart stopped. No, she can't." Michael was already starting the car. He leaned out the window toward the manager. "Call Detective Walsh right now. Tell him the suspect is fleeing through the back exit. Tell him we're following her and she's heading toward Route 17 eastbound. Can you do that?" Yes, I'll call right now." The manager was already running back toward the office. "Michael," Elizabeth started. "I'm not letting her disappear with our daughters," Michael said, his voice tight with determination and barely controlled fear. "Not again, not after 15 years. He drove quickly toward the back of the property, following the manager's shouted directions. The service road was narrow, poorly lit, winding between campsites and storage areas. They emerged from the back exit just in time to see taillights disappearing onto the main road. A white camper van, rust stains visible even in the fading light. "That's her," Elizabeth breathed. "That's them. Michael, our daughters are in that van." Michael pressed down on the accelerator, merging onto Route 17. The camper van was perhaps 200 yards ahead, weaving slightly between lanes. "She knows someone's looking for her," Michael said. "She's driving erratically." "Can we catch up?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tight. "I'm trying not to get too close. If she realizes we're following her, she might do something dangerous." Michael's hands were tight on the steering wheel. "The police should be on their way. We just need to keep her in sight." But ahead of them the camper van was accelerating, running through a yellow light, forcing a car to brake sharply with a screech of tires. She's panicking, Elizabeth said. Oh God, Michael, she's going to hurt them. The camper van ahead was picking up speed, weaving through evening traffic. Michael followed at a distance, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the vehicle. Elizabeth gripped the dashboard, her breath coming in short gasps. "Where are the police?" she whispered. "Why aren't they here yet?" "They're coming," Michael said. "They have to be coming." The camper van made a sudden sharp turn onto a smaller road. Michael followed, tires squealing slightly. They were entering an industrial area now, warehouses with dark windows, storage facilities surrounded by chain-link fences, fewer cars, longer stretches of empty road. Margaret was driving faster now. The camper van swayed dangerously with each turn, its boxy shape not built for speed. "She's going to flip it," Michael said, his voice tense. "At this speed, in that top-heavy vehicle." "Don't let her out of your sight," Elizabeth said. "Michael, please don't lose them." "I won't. I promise." The road ahead straightened out. The camper van accelerated, pulling further away. And then sirens. Faint at first, then growing louder. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance behind them. "Thank God," Elizabeth breathed. "Thank God they're here." But Margaret must have heard the sirens too. The camper van lurched forward with even more speed, engine straining. "She's running," Michael said. "She's really running." Ahead, at an intersection, 3 police cars appeared from different directions, lights blazing, sirens wailing. They moved with practiced precision, angling their vehicles across the road to create a blockade. Michael slowed their car, staying back. "They've got her," he said. "There's nowhere for her to go." For a moment, it looked like Margaret would stop. The camper van's brake lights flared bright red. The vehicle slowed. But then, impossibly, the brake lights went dark. The engine roared. The camper van lurched forward, trying to swerve around the police blockade, trying to escape onto the shoulder of the road. "No!" Elizabeth screamed. "No, stop! The girls are in there!" But Margaret was committed to her desperate gamble. The camper van's wheels left the pavement, hitting the gravelly shoulder. Loose stones sprayed out behind the vehicle. It fishtailed violently. Margaret overcorrected. The camper van's wheels caught on something, a drainage dip, a chunk of broken concrete. The vehicle lurched, fishtailing wildly. It happened in slow motion and all at once. The camper van tilted onto 2 wheels, hung suspended for an impossible moment. Elizabeth could see it silhouetted against the darkening sky, could see the windows, could imagine her daughters inside, terrified, and then it fell. The impact was devastating. Metal screamed against pavement. Glass exploded in glittering bursts. The camper van slid across the road on its side, sparks flying for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. 20 feet, 30. Finally coming to rest in a shallow ditch beside the road, lying like a wounded animal. No. Elizabeth was out of the car before Michael had even stopped, her door flying open, her feet hitting the pavement running. "Sophie! Rachel! My babies!" Michael caught her after only a few steps, his arms wrapping around her waist, holding her back as police officers swarmed the scene. "Elizabeth, stop! Let them help! You can't! Let me go! Those are my daughters! My babies are in there!" She was sobbing now, fighting against his hold, but Michael held firm. "I know," he said into her ear, his own voice breaking. "I know, sweetheart. But you have to let the police handle this. Please, please, Elizabeth." Officers surrounded the crashed vehicle, weapons drawn but pointed down, their voices sharp and commanding. "Police! If you can hear me, don't move. Help is coming. Stay where you are." The camper van's driver's side door, now facing upward like a hatch, groaned open. A figure appeared, climbing out awkwardly, moving stiffly. Margaret Holbrook. Her face was bloodied from a cut on her forehead, blood streaming down into her eyes. She was crying, making gasping, panicked sounds. An officer moved forward to help her down from the tilted vehicle. The moment her feet touched the ground, he pulled her arms behind her back. "Ma'am, put your hands behind your back. You're being detained." "My girls!" Margaret screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "My girls are in there. Grace, Claire, please, someone help them. They're hurt, please." She struggled against the officer, but he held firm, guiding her away from the wreckage toward a police car. More officers converged on the back of the camper van. The rear doors had buckled inward from the impact, warped and jammed. 2 officers grabbed crowbars from their vehicles and worked to pry them open, metal shrieking in protest. "Grace! Claire!" Margaret was still screaming, her voice breaking. "Please, please be okay. I'm here. I'm right here." The doors finally gave way with a tortured groan. An officer climbed inside the tilted vehicle, his flashlight beam cutting through the interior darkness. Elizabeth held her breath. She was shaking so violently that Michael had to support most of her weight. Her lips moved in silent prayer. "Please God, please Jesus, please let them be alive. Please let them be okay. Please, please, please." A moment later, the officer's voice called out, "I've got 2 females here, both conscious. We need paramedics." "Thank you," Elizabeth gasped. "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you." The officer emerged from the camper van, helping a young woman climb out. Grace. Sophie. Her face was pale with shock, a cut bleeding on her left arm, her hair disheveled, but she was moving on her own, conscious, alive. Another officer caught her as she stumbled, her legs unsteady, and helped her sit on the ground away from the wreckage. Then the second officer appeared at the opening, reaching back inside, and helped another young woman out. Claire. Rachel. She was holding her head, moving more slowly, appearing dazed but also conscious, also alive. "They're alive," Elizabeth whispered. "Michael, they're alive. Our daughters are alive." Her knees gave out. Michael caught her, lowering them both to the ground, holding her as she wept with relief so overwhelming it was almost painful. An ambulance arrived, sirens wailing, adding to the chaos of lights and sounds. Paramedics rushed to the twins with equipment bags and backboards. Elizabeth watched as they knelt beside her daughters, checking vital signs, asking questions, shining lights in their eyes. A man in a suit and badge approached. Detective Walsh, Elizabeth realized through her tears. He knelt beside them. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison?" "Yes," Michael managed, his voice hoarse. "That's us." "Your daughters appear to have survived with minor injuries. The paramedics are checking them now, but they're both conscious and responsive. That's very good news." "Can we go to them?" Elizabeth asked, trying to stand. "Can we?" "Not yet," Detective Walsh said gently but firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I need you to stay here for just a moment. I know this is hard, but those young women are confused and frightened right now. They don't know what's happening. Let the paramedics stabilize them first." Across the scene, Margaret had been placed in the back of a police car, but the door was still open. She was leaning forward, trying to see her nieces, still crying. And then she saw Elizabeth and Michael. Something shifted in Margaret's face. The desperation transformed into anger, into rage, into a fury born of fear and 15 years of living a lie that was now crumbling. "You!" she screamed, lunging forward against the officer's restraining hands. "This is your fault. All of this. You did this." Elizabeth stood slowly, Michael rising with her. They walked toward the police car, toward the woman who had stolen their lives. "You let them go out alone," Margaret continued, her voice breaking with emotion, spit flying from her lips. 6 years old, 6-year-old children trick-or-treating by themselves. What kind of parents do that? You were negligent. You were careless. You didn't deserve them. "We let them walk 2 houses down our own street," Elizabeth said, her voice low and shaking with 15 years of contained fury, finally finding release. "Our own safe street, in our own neighborhood, where children played outside every single day. You abandoned them," Margaret shrieked. "You stole them." Elizabeth's voice rose to match Margaret's, all the grief and rage of 15 years pouring out. "You're a kidnapper, a thief, a criminal. You made us think our babies were dead. Do you understand what that did to us? Do you have any idea?" "I saved them," Margaret was crying now, tears mixing with the blood on her face. "I gave them a home. I gave them love. I gave them everything, everything you failed to give them. You gave them lies." Michael stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. You erased their memories. You stole their identities. You made them forget their own parents. They didn't need you, Margaret spat. They were happy with me. They had a good life, a better life than you could have given them. They needed their real family, Elizabeth said, her voice breaking. They needed their mother and father. They needed their real names, their real lives. You took all of that from them, from us. 15 years, Margaret, 15 years of birthdays and Christmases and first days of school. 15 years of watching them grow up. You stole that from us. You stole their childhood from them. I protected them, Margaret screamed, straining against the officer's grip. I loved them. I would have died for them. Then you should have let them go, Michael said quietly. If you really loved them, you would have let them go home. They were my children, Margaret's voice dissolved into sobs. My babies died. God took my babies from me, and then he sent me those girls. He sent them to me. They were meant to be mine. They were never yours, Elizabeth said, and her voice now was steady, calm, cold as winter. They were ours. They are ours. And thank God, thank Jesus, that he didn't let them stay lost forever, that he led us to them, that he showed us the truth in a photograph we'd looked at 1,000 times but never really seen. You thought you could hide them forever. You thought your secret was safe, but God knew where they were, and he brought us here. He brought our babies home. Detective Walsh stepped forward. That's enough, Mrs. Holbrook. You need to stop talking. But Margaret wasn't done. She looked at Elizabeth with eyes full of anguish and hatred. They won't even remember you, she hissed. They'll call me Aunt. They'll ask for me. They'll cry for me. You'll see. You'll never really get them back. Elizabeth met her eyes. We'll see about that. Detective Walsh moved to close the police car door. He looked down at Margaret with a mixture of pity and disgust. Margaret Holbrook, he said, his voice formal and clear, you are under arrest for 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of false imprisonment, child endangerment, and fleeing from law enforcement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you? Margaret slumped back in the seat, her fury spent, leaving only broken sobs. Yes, she whispered. I understand. Detective Walsh closed the door with a firm click. Across the scene, the paramedics had moved Sophie and Rachel toward the ambulance. They were sitting on the back bumper now, wrapped in blankets despite the warm evening, answering questions, being checked over with practiced efficiency. And then Sophie looked up. Her eyes scanned the scene, the police cars, the overturned camper van, the officers milling about, and then her gaze landed on the police car where Margaret sat visible through the window, handcuffed, crying. Aunt Margaret! Sophie tried to stand, but a paramedic gently held her shoulder. Why is she in handcuffs? What's happening? What did she do? Rachel's head whipped around following her sister's gaze. Why are they arresting her? Her voice rose with panic. She didn't do anything wrong. We just had an accident. Why? A paramedic knelt in front of them, blocking their view of Margaret. Ladies, you need to stay calm. You've both been in a serious accident. We need to check you for injuries. Can you tell me if anything hurts? I want to see my aunt, Rachel said, her voice breaking. Please, I need to see her. She's bleeding. Is she okay? Please. Your aunt is being taken care of, the paramedic said calmly. Right now, we need to focus on you two. Can you tell me your names? Grace, Sophie said automatically. Grace Elizabeth. And this is my sister Claire, Claire Marie. But where's... Can you tell me what year it is? The paramedic continued. 1984. Rachel, Claire, answered confused. But I don't understand what's happening. Why won't anyone tell us what's happening? Elizabeth started toward them, but Detective Walsh stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. Not yet, Mrs. Morrison. Give the paramedics a few more minutes. Let them make sure your daughters are stable. Then we'll talk to them, I promise. Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face, watching her daughters from across the scene, so close, yet still so far away. The new Hanover Regional Medical Center was a large, modern hospital in Wilmington. Elizabeth and Michael were directed to a private waiting room where Detective Walsh stood waiting. "Your daughters are with the medical team now," he said. "They have minor injuries from the accident, cuts, bruises, nothing serious. But Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Morrison, I need you to prepare yourselves. These young women don't know you. They think Margaret is their aunt. They're frightened and asking for her. This reunion is going to be very difficult." "We understand," Michael said quietly. An hour passed. Elizabeth paced. Michael prayed. Finally, Dr. Patel appeared, a woman in her 40s with calm, professional bearing. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, your daughters are stable. The injuries will heal. But I need to tell you something important." She paused. "I've examined both young women thoroughly. The older twin has a distinctive birthmark on her left wrist, small, leaf-shaped, exactly as you described." Elizabeth's hands flew to her mouth. "Sophie," she whispered. "I've also collected DNA samples from both girls," Dr. Patel continued. "Those results will take several weeks, but they'll provide legal confirmation. Based on everything I've seen, the birthmark, the physical resemblance, the circumstances, I believe these are your daughters." "Can we see them?" Elizabeth asked, her voice breaking. "Yes. But they don't understand what's happening. Be gentle. Be patient." Dr. Patel led them down a hallway to a private room. Inside, Sophie and Rachel sat on hospital beds in hospital gowns, looking small and frightened. When they saw Elizabeth and Michael, Sophie's eyes widened. "You're the woman from the beach, the one who upset Aunt Margaret." "Yes," Elizabeth said, stepping forward carefully. "My name is Elizabeth Morrison. This is my husband, Michael." "Where's Aunt Margaret?" Rachel demanded, her voice sharp with fear. "Why did the police arrest her? What's happening?" Dr. Patel spoke gently. "I need to tell you something very difficult. Margaret Holbrook is not your aunt. Your parents didn't die. You were taken from your home in Madison, Wisconsin on Halloween 1969 when you were 6 years old." "That's insane," Rachel said. "Aunt Margaret raised us. She's our family." "My name is Sophie," the other twin said suddenly, quietly. "Grace is what she called me. But sometimes I remember another name, Sophie." Elizabeth's heart stopped. Rachel stared at her sister. "What are you talking about? Your name is Grace. Aunt Margaret named you." "Elizabeth," Sophie interrupted, looking at Elizabeth Morrison. "That's your name." "Yes," Elizabeth whispered. "And your real name is Sophie. Sophie Elizabeth. You were named after your grandmother." She pulled out the photograph, Halloween Day, 1969. 2 little girls in golden fairy costumes, glitter on their faces, smiling. Sophie took it with trembling hands. She stared at the image. "I remember this," she breathed. "I remember wearing this dress. Someone singing." "That was me," Elizabeth said, tears streaming. "I sang to you every night. The Yellow Rose of Texas. Your father played it on the phonograph." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "The Yellow Rose of Texas," she repeated softly. And then, haltingly, she began to hum the tune. Elizabeth's breath caught. "Yes, yes, sweetheart, that's our song." Dr. Patel gently took Sophie's wrist, showing Rachel the birthmark. "Your sister has this distinctive mark. Mrs. Morrison documented it in medical records when Sophie was born. It's an exact match." Rachel looked at the birthmark, the photograph, then at Elizabeth and Michael. "Why would she lie to us?" Her voice cracked. "She lost her own children," Michael said gently. "Twin children, the same age you were. She was alone and grieving. When she saw you, something broke inside her. She took you. She convinced herself you were meant to be hers." "We're not hers," Rachel whispered, crying now. "We're not anyone's." "You're ours," Elizabeth said. She moved closer, slowly. "You're Sophie and Rachel Morrison, born on March 15, 1963, at Madison General Hospital. Sophie, you were born first at 6:47 in the morning. Rachel, you came 12 minutes later. You were both 7 pounds, 6 ounces. You were 6 years old when you disappeared." "I don't remember," Sophie sobbed. "Tell us something," Rachel said desperately. "Something only parents would know." Elizabeth knelt before Sophie. You had a stuffed rabbit, white with blue ears. You named him Mr. Hops. When you were 4, you lost him at the grocery store. You cried for 3 days until your father found him. Sophie's eyes widened. "Mr. Hops," she whispered. "I remember Mr. Hops." Elizabeth turned to Rachel. "You had a pink blanket with white stars. You called it your soft. You took it everywhere." Rachel's hand went to her mouth. "My soft," she breathed. "I remember something pink." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Sophie stood slowly. She crossed to Elizabeth. She looked at this woman who claimed to be her mother, at her eyes, her face, the desperate love written in every line, and Sophie stepped into Elizabeth's arms. Elizabeth held her daughter, living, breathing, real, and wept. After a moment, Sophie's arms came up, returning the embrace. "I'm sorry I don't remember everything," she whispered. "You have nothing to be sorry for," Elizabeth said. "Nothing. This wasn't your fault." Michael approached Rachel, who still sat frozen. "I know this is overwhelming," he said quietly. "We're not asking you to accept us immediately, but Rachel, we're your parents. We love you. We never stopped searching, and we're here now." Rachel looked at him, at his kind eyes, at the patience and love in his face. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and took his hand. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, we'll try." And in that hospital room, a family torn apart 15 years ago took its first fragile steps toward healing. At the police station, Margaret Holbrook sat across from Detective Walsh in a small interrogation room. She was handcuffed to the table. The cut on her forehead had been bandaged. "Margaret," Detective Walsh said, "I'm going to ask you some questions about what happened on October 31st, 1969. Margaret said nothing. She stared at the table. "Margaret, the evidence is overwhelming. We have the photograph showing your dog in Madison on Halloween. We have your own reaction to Elizabeth Morrison. We have your flight from law enforcement, and will soon have DNA confirmation." Margaret's shoulders began to shake. Tears rolled down her face. "I lost my family," she said quietly. "In March of 1969, a car accident, my husband Daniel, my son Thomas, my daughter Caroline. They were 6 years old, twins. I was driving. It was raining. I lost control." She looked up with hollow eyes. "I was the only one who survived." "I'm very sorry for your loss," Detective Walsh said, "but that doesn't explain kidnapping." "I couldn't live with it," Margaret said. "The guilt, the emptiness. Every day was agony. I moved to Madison to escape, but the memories followed. And then," she paused, "then I saw them. Halloween afternoon. I had come back to the house to pick up documents I'd forgotten. I was only going to be there an hour. No one was supposed to know." "But you saw the Morrison twins?" "They were walking down the street, just the two of them. 2 little girls in golden fairy costumes, identical. The same age Thomas and Caroline would have been." Her voice broke. "And I thought, maybe God was giving me a second chance." "So you approached them." "They knew me. They'd seen me around the neighborhood. They loved my dog. When I said I had puppies at my house, they came willingly. They trusted me." She was crying harder now. "They got in my car. I drove left through back roads and took them to my house in North Carolina, so no one saw me, and I couldn't let them go. I couldn't bear to lose children again." "What did you tell them?" "At first, nothing. I gave them food, let them play with Duchess. They thought it was an adventure. But when they wanted to go home, I told them there had been an accident. I told them their parents had died. I told them I was their aunt. And they believed you. They were 6 years old, confused and scared and grieving. Of course they believed me." "Then you changed their identities." "At first I had no plan about it, but over the following weeks I created false documents, new identities. Margaret Holbrook, widowed aunt raising her orphaned nieces, Grace and Claire. You homeschooled them, kept them isolated." "I protected them," Margaret said fiercely. "I gave them a good life. I taught them everything. I loved them." "You imprisoned them," Detective Walsh said. "You stole them. You erased their identities. You made them live a lie for 15 years. Margaret's face twisted. I gave them everything I had. They were my reason to live. But they weren't yours to take. You took 15 years from their real parents. 15 years of birthdays, Christmases, milestones. I know, Margaret whispered. When Elizabeth showed up at the beach, I knew it was over. I just wanted a little more time with my girls before I lost them forever. They were never your girls, Detective Walsh said quietly. And now you'll face the consequences. Margaret slumped in her chair. What will happen to them? They'll have their real parents. They'll have counseling, support, time to heal. And me? You'll be charged with 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of false imprisonment, child endangerment, and fleeing from law enforcement. You're looking at a substantial prison sentence. Margaret nodded slowly. I deserve it, she said. Please tell the girls I'm sorry. Tell them I love them. You can tell them yourself, Detective Walsh said, if they choose to see you. But Margaret, your apology may never be enough. I know, Margaret whispered. 2 months had passed since the night of the crash. The DNA results had confirmed with 99.99% certainty what Elizabeth had known in her heart from the moment she saw Sophie's birthmark. Sophie and Rachel Morrison were definitively, scientifically, legally the daughters of Elizabeth and Michael Morrison. Margaret Holbrook had pleaded guilty to all charges, 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of false imprisonment, child endangerment, and fleeing from law enforcement. The evidence against her had been overwhelming, the photograph proving her presence in Madison on Halloween, her own confession, and the DNA results that removed all doubt. She had been sentenced to 25 years in state prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. At the sentencing hearing, the judge had called it one of the most egregious cases of child abduction I have ever seen. The months since had been filled with therapy sessions, legal proceedings, difficult conversations, and slow, painful healing. Sophie and Rachel were learning to reconcile the life they'd known with the truth of who they really were. There were good days and hard days, memories returning, and questions that had no easy answers. But tonight, on Christmas Eve 1984, none of that mattered. Tonight, the Morrison family was going to church. Snow fell gently on the streets of Madison as the Morrison family walked toward St. Mary's Church. Elizabeth walked between her daughters, arms linked. Michael walked beside them, his hand resting on Rachel's shoulder. They moved slowly, savoring the moment, their first Christmas Eve service together as a complete family in 15 years. The small church glowed with candlelight, its stained glass windows casting colored patterns onto the snow. Inside, the scent of pine and candle wax filled the air. The congregation was already gathering, their voices joining in quiet conversation. As the Morrison family entered, heads turned. The story of the twin sisters' miraculous return had spread through the community, the photograph that revealed the truth, the Beachtown discovery, the reunion after 15 years of prayer. Some people smiled, others wiped away tears. Elizabeth felt the weight of those stares, but she held her head high. Her daughters were home. That was all that mattered. They found their pew, the same one the Morrison family had occupied years ago, before the world fell apart. Elizabeth sat between Sophie and Rachel, Michael on Rachel's other side, complete again. The service began. The congregation rose to sing O Holy Night, voices blending in the vaulted space. Elizabeth's voice trembled as she sang, overwhelmed by gratitude. 15 years of Christmases without her children. 15 years of singing these carols alone, praying for a miracle that seemed impossible. And now, here they were, Sophie and Rachel grown into young women, standing beside her. Alive. Real. Home. Pastor Williams stepped to the pulpit, his white hair catching the candlelight. Tonight, he said, his voice warm and gentle, we celebrate the miracle of hope born in darkness, of impossible things becoming possible through faith. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the congregation and resting briefly on the Morrison family. Many of you know that this Christmas, our community celebrates its own miracle. The return of two daughters who were lost for 15 years. The reunion of a family that never stopped hoping, never stopped praying, never stopped believing that God was listening. Elizabeth felt Sophie's hand slip into hers. On her other side, Rachel leaned closer. The simple comfort of their presence brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. "Let us now have a moment of silent prayer," Pastor Williams said. "A moment to reflect on the miracles in our own lives, to give thanks for answered prayers, to ask for continued grace and guidance." The church fell silent, except for the soft crackling of candles. Elizabeth closed her eyes. "Thank you, Jesus," she prayed silently. "Thank you for never giving up on us. Thank you for that photograph, for showing me what I needed to see. Thank you for leading me to that beach in North Carolina. Thank you for bringing my babies home." In the silence, her thoughts turned to Margaret Holbrook, the woman who had caused 15 years of unbearable pain, the woman who had stolen her daughters and made them believe she was their family, the woman now sitting in a prison cell, facing decades of punishment for what she'd done. Elizabeth had every right to hate her, every reason to let bitterness consume her heart. But sitting here in the sacred space, with her daughters warm and alive beside her, Elizabeth felt something unexpected: forgiveness. Not because Margaret deserved it, not because what she'd done could ever be excused or forgotten, but because Elizabeth understood now, in a way she couldn't have before, that Margaret had loved Sophie and Rachel. In her broken, twisted way, she had genuinely loved them. Margaret had fed them, clothed them, educated them. She had cared for them when they were sick. She had kept them safe, even if she had no right to keep them at all. It was wrong. It would always be wrong. But the love had been real, and holding on to hatred, letting it poison the precious time Elizabeth now had with her daughters, would only give Margaret's crime more power over their lives. "Jesus," Elizabeth prayed, "help me to forgive her, not for her sake, but for mine, for my daughter's sake. Help us all to heal, and help Margaret to find whatever peace she can in the years ahead." The silent prayer ended. Pastor Williams spoke again. "Now we come to the lighting of the candles, a tradition that reminds us how light spreads through darkness, how one flame shared with another can illuminate an entire room." He lit the first candle. The flame was passed down the rows, person to person, light spreading through the congregation. When the flame reached their pew, Michael lit his candle, then turned to Rachel. Rachel lit hers and turned to Sophie. Sophie lit hers and turned to Elizabeth. For a moment, mother and daughter looked at each other in the flickering light. Sophie's eyes, so like Michael's, so like the 6-year-old child Elizabeth remembered, shimmered with tears. "I love you, Mom," Sophie whispered. Elizabeth's throat tightened. She could barely speak. "I love you too, sweetheart." Sophie touched her candle to Elizabeth's, and the flame jumped between them, light spreading from daughter to mother. Elizabeth held her candle high, adding her light to the hundreds of others now illuminating the church. The darkness was banished. Hope had won. The congregation sang Silent Night, and Elizabeth's voice joined with her family's, with the community's, with the joy of a prayer answered after 15 years of waiting. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. When the service ended, the family stood together in the church vestibule, greeting neighbors who came to hug them, to cry with them, to celebrate the miracle they represented. Finally, they stepped out into the snowy night. Christmas lights twinkled in windows up and down the street. The world felt clean and new and full of possibility. "That was beautiful," Rachel said softly, linking her arm through Michael's. "It was," Sophie agreed, on Elizabeth's other side. "We'll come every year from now on," Elizabeth said, "all of us together." "Every year," Michael echoed. They walked home through the quiet streets, their footsteps muffled by fresh snow. As they approached the house on Chamberlain Avenue, the house where two little girls had once prepared for Halloween in golden fairy costumes, Elizabeth looked up at the stars, the same stars that had shone on that terrible night 15 years ago, the same stars that had watched over her daughters through all those lost years, the same stars that had guided her to a beach in North Carolina that day. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered to the sky, to God, to the universe that had finally answered her prayers. "Thank you." Sophie heard her and squeezed her hand. "We're home, Mom," she said simply. "We're finally home." Inside the house, Michael built a fire in the fireplace while Elizabeth made hot chocolate. Sophie and Rachel settled on the sofa, looking around the living room, at the Christmas tree with its mix of old and new ornaments, at the photographs on the mantel, at the home they were slowly learning to call their own. "Mom?" Sophie said as Elizabeth handed her a steaming mug. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Will you sing the song?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Of course." And so she sang, her voice filling the warm room, carrying the melody that had once lulled two little girls to sleep, the melody that had been silent for 15 years, the melody that was finally coming home. "There's a yellow rose in Texas that I am going to see. No other fellow knows her. No other, only me." Sophie and Rachel closed their eyes and listened. Michael sat beside them, his arm around his family. And in that moment, surrounded by candlelight and Christmas warmth, by love that had endured 15 years of separation and grief, they were whole again. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the streets of Madison in white, covering the past, making way for new beginnings. In the Morrison home, the fire crackled. The Christmas tree glowed. A mother sang to her daughters for the first time in 15 years. And somewhere in the night, a prayer of gratitude rose to heaven for miracles, for grace, for second chances, for families brought home. Thanks for watching. If this story got to you, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next mystery. See you soon.